Hi, everybody. My name is John Stritzinger. I'm here to do a speech tonight for Philosophy 213. It's part of a book that I've been writing for the last 6 months or so about the U.S. government and the structure of its finances. I am taking on an ethical issue, and that's regards to financial money printing. And that is essentially when you have a debt and you just essentially are printing money to pay for it. So the U.S. Mint literally makes more dollars, and they go out and they pay their bills with those dollars. So it is exactly what you think of. Now, my talk today is going to go through a number of things, but when we reach the end, what I'm really asking for and my call to action is that the American government and American corporations behave in more or less the same way under steady state operations. But in crises, in wars, and in pandemics, that the U.S. government wouldn't be bound by the same regulations. So we would suspend SEC enforcement of their actions during emergency designations. So that's what I'm talking about here today. Now, that's a little bit different than a balanced budget amendment. A balanced budget amendment means you literally strip the chairs off the deck whenever you have a budget hole. I'm not asking for that. I'm simply asking for the American people to be able to make decisions with their investments and with their voting based on financials, among other things that they talk about, including the last election, where both candidates really didn't talk about how they were going to ever in their lifetimes pay for the debts that they were incurring. Now, before our presentation, we did survey our class. Most of them said that they didn't have enough financial information to even have the conversation with me today, but I'm going to take it down a level and just say, look, what the U.S. government is doing is really just what consumers do. It's just a lot more complicated. And the only reason people don't really talk about the U.S. government in the way that I am doing tonight is because to actually try to value U.S. assets takes a really long time, and it's on the order of 100 spreadsheet forms. And so when you get something that complicated, you're not going to have a whole lot of people who agree with you, even if you're working for the same company. And the U.S. government certainly has a lot of interest groups that believe in GDP numbers and everything should be relative to our income, that kind of thing. And then there are people that literally believe they should be paid for what happened to their family in 1601. And those things happen too. But the reality is the U.S. government is printing money to keep the world that we live in sort of in a bubble. It doesn't really change a whole lot since the 1950s. People are doing the same things. It just costs a little bit more here or there. Well, older generations own their own homes. They make long-term buying when they go to the store, and really the only thing they spend on is out when they decide to go out to dinner. But other than that, they are pretty conservative and they control their expenses, and they're a lot less impacted by normal inflationary issues. So making decisions for them doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You might give them more benefits, but to increase the money supply isn't necessarily the right vehicle. So is what the U.S. government's doing criminal? In my opinion, it is. I'm a financial expert, and I believe the U.S. government has no real assets outside the military of more than $3 trillion. And our debt is now 10 times our real assets. And so everything that we might be able to sell is encumbered. And the only thing we really have left is national park land. Or we might be able to sell the state of Alaska and its oil fields again, and we might get $1 trillion for that. But other than that, we really don't have a whole lot. The U.S. government is in the single digits, even in the best forecast from the nicest economist And the issue is they just have no cash flow. So to me, that's a criminal issue. Now, I am the former COO of Bank of America Global Operations. I didn't decision individual loans. What I did is I collected all the data and used infrastructure to make sure that we had copies of them and that we could respond to you once they were decisioned. Now, when you go to a personal lending, you go to the bank and ask for money. They look at credit history, cash flow, and assets and security, and whether those assets are encumbered. Like you own a mortgage, you have some equity in it, but it's encumbered. It has some contracts related to it. The U.S. government, all of its assets are encumbered. It has no cash flow and it has great credit history. But if I go and ask for $10 million from the bank, I have pretty near perfect credit history, but they're going to say no because I can't support cash flow to pay off a $10 million note. Now, a simple understanding, if you just look at the money supply, you can see that almost all of our problem happened under Mr. Obama, Mr. Bush, and Mr. Trump. It is pretty substantial, and I do believe it is a criminal issue. Now, when the U.S. government was formed in 1776, it didn't own anything. It had no land, it had no revenue, it had no payment history. So what David McCullough does in his Pulitzer Prize winning book is he talks about how the states sent soldiers to fight on behalf of the American government. And here they were fighting one of the largest militaries in the world, the British Army and the British Navy. And so really the main impetus in forming a union was so that the U.S. military would have what it needs to fight. But if you look at it, really the states were paying for most or all of the budget. So that even that decision is questionable in the long run. But at the end of the day, when the U.S. government was formed and the Constitution was formed, since the states didn't own their own land, it could never be pledged as collateral in a debt deal. So the U.S. government today can't make the same argument. Pretty much when the Constitution was formed, that's when people signed contracts, and the contracts have terms with them, and those contract terms are important and lifelong. Now, in 1776, most of the states were living on the King's land grants, and we didn't have any treaties with the British government. And that carried through the 1800s all the way to the War of 1812, when the British Army marched back into the United States and decided to fight us again for the colonies. And they burned down Washington and everything we had built since then. So Alexander Hamilton started the Treasury, but here we go in 1812. It wasn't even 40 years later that the British reconsidered their positions. Now, we have a number of things that have happened since the Constitution was signed. We've entered treaties all over the world. We've increased our land holdings, not just domestically, but internationally. We have islands like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands. We bought Alaska, and all of those things we have clear title to. The United States clearly owns them. But a lot of the other items, like the original 13 colonies, we didn't get treaties signed until much later in the 1800s. So if you look today, the U.S. assets in Pennsylvania haven't really grown beyond Valley Forge. We've picked up a few national parks, but that's pretty much it. And the rest of the states are pretty much the same. The U.S. Treasury today is only solvent if our revenue exceeds our expenses. And clearly that's not the case. U.S. deficits are growing dramatically, and even worse, they're all pretty much recent. Is this a criminal action? I believe it is. So our call to action, my answer, never propose a question that you don't have an answer to, and I do have an answer. My answer is to make the U.S. government file SEC filings just like corporations do. When they have a negative incident, when they have annual financials, they have to file them on the SEC exchange. Now, if we do that, then we can have the president talk about them, and then American consumers and voters would have what they need to make decisions. So that's pretty much it. I want the U.S. government to file GAAP financials with the SEC at the end of the year. And when we do that, and when we have that information before elections, then we will end the world with a much better place. So we seek a world where corporations and the US government are held to the same standards, where US government officers can literally be prosecuted, so that what happens with Enron doesn't happen with the United States like it has under Joe Biden. We have some other opportunities and things for change, and they include changes in the Supreme Court, profitability requirements, and changes in the US military, which would take a while to go through, and I've tried. Some criticisms of what I'm saying is, hey, the US government has a lot more assets, but they're all in Fannie and Freddie Mac, where they own 70% of American residential mortgages today. So people say, hey, John, you can't say it's a criminal action. We actually have more assets, and I think we don't. So anyway, other than this new act that I propose, I'm also asking for state governors to be activists and to try to prosecute the US government on original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court, because I think they can put the US government into a probate situation. And certainly due to the irrationality of the last few years, we believe that's merited. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your time today. I have a lot of slides and backup, and I will submit those to the instructor, but I have tried to present them, and I went from 17 to 40 minutes, depending on how many I included. So that's it. Thank you very much.